A familiar face is returning to the Pacific Northwest to join Pete Carroll's staff. What does that mean for the Seahawks offensively? Find out in our latest installment of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Hope everybody enjoyed their weekend. It's Mock Draft Monday, and back by popular demand, very popular demand. We've been getting a lot of messages about this on social media. Rob and I will be critiquing a handful of fan-submitted mock drafts today for the first time. We'll do this a few times leading up to the real thing in late April. So we've got a handful of drafts submitted by you, our valued listeners, that we're going to be diving into. And, of course, some big coaching staff changes on the horizon, both additions and departures that we'll be breaking down as well on this jam-packed Monday episode that is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the App Store. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On. That's all caps in the game. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Middle of last week, the Seahawks had their first major departure from their coaching staff with Dave Canales going to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as their new offensive coordinator. The Seahawks wasted a little time finding his replacement, and they got a highly qualified one coming back to the Pacific Northwest. This will be his first time with the Seahawks, but heralding from Richland High School as well as Central Washington University, Greg Olson, and no, not the tight end that played for the Seahawks a couple years ago, but longtime NFL assistant Greg Olson will be joining the Seahawks. Expected to have that deal officially announced tomorrow. He was at the facility today, finalizing a contract to join the Seahawks and Pete Carroll's staff as the new quarterback coach. Rob, this was not a name that I actually had on the radar going into this process. Maybe we should have thought about this, but he was on the Rams coaching staff last season as a senior offensive assistant, 14 years as an offensive coordinator in the NFL, more than 30 years of college and NFL coaching experience, and he's had a lot of success with quarterbacks at both levels. And now Greg Olson gets to finally come back home and coach for the Seattle Seahawks.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. I think that you did a really nice job of kind of explaining that, just acknowledging Greg Olson's roots in the state of Washington. Certainly appreciate the Central Washington University CWU reference, just because, of course, I'm a graduate of Central Washington as well. And Greg Olson, I think, is a name that maybe we should have been talking about a little bit because he is as respected as he is. As you referenced, I mean, he's been coaching for a long time, and this is 21 years in the NFL, and six different teams he was the offensive coordinator with. And so that, to me, is one of the unusual things here, is that it's just rare to see a guy who was previously an offensive coordinator come back into more of a quarterback-specific coaching role. But I also think that it kind of speaks to the fact that with Greg Olson at 59 years old, that he is kind of towards the end of his career. He and his wife, Lisa, she is also a coach, a very good one at that, track and field coach for a long, long time, and had several stops throughout Washington State as well as Purdue, where Greg Olson began his college or part of his college coaching career, worked with Drew Brees and a longtime head coach there, Joe Tiller, really where he started to make a name for himself. And that's one of the reasons why Greg Olson bounced around the NFL as much as he did, because he and his wife and their twins, a boy and a girl, who are both very talented athletes themselves. Daughter is now playing volleyball at UCLA, and the son is a football player at Cal Poly. This is a family that is committed to athleticism, committed to each other. And again, that's one of the reasons why he's bounced around. So for those Seahawks fans out there, they're like, why did the Seahawks sign a coach that doesn't have the track record. It hasn't been with one program for a long time. I think that you're getting kind of caught up in statistics and things like that. When you look at just the coaches that Greg Olsen has worked with, and I'm sure that Pete Carroll talked to his former defensive coordinator and Gus Bradley, who was the head coach that Greg Olsen worked with the Jacksonville Jaguars, for example, or John Gruden, who Greg Olsen worked with Las Vegas and previously the Oakland Raiders for a long time as well. I mean, and of course, with Shane Waldron and Andy Dickerson knowing a lot about Greg Olsen and their time with the Los Angeles Rams. And Greg Olsen was 3 times with the Rams, so back to the St. Louis days as well. But the point is that this is a head coach who is as proven as it gets and certainly has a great deal of really talented quarterbacks on his resume. He also has some young quarterbacks who had some of their best seasons under him. So I think that this is a really exciting development for the Seahawks at the quarterback position. Sure, you're going to miss Dave Canales as well as Brad Idzik, the wide receiver coach from the Seahawks, who followed Canales to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But as far as the Seahawks kind of getting a coach that has a great deal of experience, that has I think that just the background to work with veterans or young quarterbacks alike, I think that it really sets up very nicely for the Seahawks moving forward.
I'm just going to be blunt. This is a home run hire. And sometimes when we look at these additions to coaching staffs, especially with the Seahawks, there's always question marks about fit. But because Greg Olsen has worked with Shane Waldron and Andy Dickerson in the past, he's got 2 years under his belt in Sean McVay's system, so he should be able to seamlessly walk right in as the quarterback coach in the system. And he's been with John Gruden. He's been with a number of other coaching staffs. He has delved into a number of different types of schemes, even though he's largely a West Coast guy. That's a perfect fit for what the Seahawks are going to be doing. That's what Pete Carroll loves to run his offense through. So this should be as good of a hire as the Seahawks could have possibly made to replace Dave Canales. Again, that could potentially be a big loss, but if you are going to be able to find a successor of this caliber and then quickly plug him onto your staff as your quarterback coach, as you mentioned, the track record, coaching John Kitna at Central Washington, John Kitna, an NAIA school, by the way, that you graduated from, and becoming a 16-year NFL vet that started a lot of games in the league, including several years with the Seattle Seahawks coming into the NFL. Drew Brees became a future Hall of Famer in Joe Tiller's offense, but who was the quarterback coach there? It was Greg Olsen. And then in the NFL, yes, he's coached some really bad teams, but I want you to just chew on this for a second, Rob. Josh Freeman, who was out of the league by 2015. His second year in the league, he had 25 touchdown passes and just 6 interceptions. Who was the offensive coordinator for Tampa Bay that year when they went 10-6? It was Greg Olsen. Blake Bortles threw more than 30 touchdown passes in one of the seasons that Greg Olsen was the offensive coordinator in Jacksonville. And oh, by the way, Jared Goff, when the Rams made the Super Bowl in 2017, and Greg Olsen was his quarterback coach, 28 touchdown passes, 7 interceptions. It, in my opinion, was the best season he's had in his entire career. And so the track record speaks for itself, whether it's been the NFL, whether it's been older quarterbacks. Jeff Garcia, at 31 years of age, threw 32 touchdowns in 2001, the only year that Olsen was the quarterback coach for the 49ers. So again, whether it's veterans, whether it's incoming rookies, young quarterbacks, it hasn't mattered. He just has been really good and has a great success record with quarterbacks at all levels. And I think that creates a lot of intrigue here because we don't know if Geno Smith's going to be back. All signs are pointing that that's going to be the case. And he's shown he can work with veteran quarterbacks, has a long track record doing that, but he's also had great experiences where Josh Freeman had that breakout year in his second season in Tampa Bay and some of the other young quarterbacks that have flourished under Greg Olsen's tutelage. So maybe this is a sign that Seattle's like, you know what? We got this veteran quarterback coach. Maybe we can go draft a guy in the first round, one of those 2 first-rounders. So I think it just adds a little bit more intrigue as we keep winding down this offseason process.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think that, I love that you mentioned like Jeff Garcia, for example, or Drew Brees. I mean, because there's been enough time since the story broke with Greg Olsen. And again, as you mentioned, for those of you who are just kind of jumping in partway through the podcast, the Seahawks are expected to be hiring Greg Olsen, longtime NFL coach to take over as their quarterback coach for this franchise that is not the former Seahawks and Carolina Panthers and Fox color commentator Greg Olson. This is Greg Olson, Olson rather than Olsen. Anyways, but if you go back and read some of the stories about Greg Olson, Seattle's new quarterback coach, and the success that he has had with some of those former quarterbacks, you read about the things that, Drew Brees has said about him, that there's so many of the other quarterbacks that he has worked with, Jeff Garcia, what they have to say about him. And it's all just heaping praise on how competitive, how intense, how fun-loving that Greg Olson is. And so, again, I think that if you just look up the man's Wikipedia page and you see that he has bounced around the NFL 2 years here, 3 years, that the longest that he'd been anywhere was 4 years, then you might get the idea that, this is a journeyman coach and he has a hard time developing relationships. In fact, it's the exact opposite. That it's just he and, again, his wife's commitment to each other, to their family, is one of the reasons why they chose the coaching profession. They're going to bounce around a little bit, but that they have as many people in their background that are, kind of championing their causes. I think that this is kind of a hand in glove fit for the Seahawks because we know how enthusiastic Pete Carroll is. And so I just think that Greg Olson and Pete Carroll are going to work very well together. And one last thing about Greg Olson, of course, I've been scouting for a long time, going to an awful lot of pro days. And Greg Olson is one of the very few quarterback coaches who I've seen go to a number of these pro days. I do know that the Seahawks have often sent some of their positional coaches to pro days. So for those of you out there who are excited about the possibility of the Seahawks drafting a quarterback, you just got a quarterback coach, at least that's what we expect, is you just got a quarterback coach who has the experience of actually scouting the position as well as coaching it up.
Yep, it's just more intrigue, even more intrigue going into this process. Who knows what the Seahawks are going to do, but you do have a guy in Greg Olson that has been a regular at pro days, and he's been actively involved in looking at young quarterbacks throughout his time in the NFL. And he's got an extensive college background too. And so that makes it interesting to see what the Seahawks are going to decide to do. And they could have Geno and a rookie come in. That's absolutely not out of the question here in this process either. We'll see what happens, but it looks like it's going to happen here the next day. It's going to become official that Greg Olson will be the new quarterback coach for the Seahawks. And then time will tell which quarterbacks he's going to be working with in 2023. Coming up next, it's Mock Draft Monday. We're going to be digging into a number of fan-submitted mock drafts, 7-rounders. We're really excited about this. We have a few rules that we'll go through at the beginning, but we're going to dive into a handful of those and critique, discuss the picks we like and the picks we don't. Coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Ultimate Football GM. We're really geeked out by our new partner and sponsor of today's episode, the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream can now come true, and this game is definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're responsible for everything from hiring the right coaches and coordinators, maybe go out and get your own Greg Olson, trading players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of the season. All of this comes in a challenging and realistic game world. I'm currently trying my best to emulate John Schneider and make the most of my draft choices. The Honolulu Sharks have been in the cellar for a couple of seasons, and I am on the hot seat. I need to get this team turned around moving forward. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. It's a blast, and our listeners should join in the fun in their own league. Locked On Seahawks listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On. That's in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the App Store. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks, your home for Seahawks coverage 5 days a week on the Locked On Network, or team every day. Glad as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether this is your first time checking out the podcast or you are a diehard regular listener. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Let's get to Mock Draft Monday, and back by popular demand, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, this has been a common theme on social media for about 2 weeks. when do we get a chance to submit our own 7-round mock draft so you guys can go through them? We did this last year, and it's clearly something that our listeners enjoy. So we're bringing it back. We'll do this a few times leading up to the draft on April 27th through 29th. We're going to be digging through some mock drafts submitted by you, our diehard listeners. And there were only 2 rules at play here. You had to make at least 11 selections. You know John Schneider is going to be smiling about that, getting that many draft picks to make on draft weekend. And the second thing, I worded it kind of funny, so I understand why some of you thought, oh, this means I can pick a quarterback early, but it was supposed to be you can only pick a quarterback after the 3rd round or later. There were a few of you that had really good mock drafts where you picked a quarterback earlier. Maybe we'll let that one slide because I'll admit the wording was not great. But without further ado, let's get to it. We're going to look at 4 mock drafts submitted by you, our listeners. We wish we could go through more, but due to time and how much Rob and I ramble on, we start talking about picks. 4 is going to be the right number today. And Rob, there were a couple that jumped out to you. I'm going to give you the mic here. What's the first mock draft that we're going to be looking at here?
Yeah, I'm going to look at one that was produced by somebody on Twitter who goes by @HawkAstrologer. And so I'm just going to kind of read off some of the selections made. And one of the things, as you said, Corbin, is just that we were kind of overwhelmed by just the sheer number of mock drafts that were sent to us. 50, 60 different mock drafts out there. That's an awful lot of names. So thank you, as always, to all of all the people who are contributing mock drafts, all of the listeners, all the viewers on YouTube. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to go through this Hawkstrologer mock draft because I think that it's kind of a fascinating approach on how we might see John Schneider attack this draft. Now, you mentioned the 2 rules, and I'm going to focus in on that very first one, the fact that he wanted to have 11 draft picks. Well, the Seahawks having 10 draft picks right now, obviously that promotes trades. And obviously there's no such ground rules when it comes to John Schneider and the Seahawks making their selections, but we are going to do this multiple times over the course of the next several weeks leading up to the draft. And so we are going to want to see some different strategies out there. And this, to me, is an interesting one because there is a slight trade down, which is going to help the Seahawks acquire the Las Vegas Raiders 2024 first round pick. So that was one of the kind of the characteristics I was kind of looking for, is to see if you could get a pick for next year's draft as well. And then also I wanted to see someone who took a mock draft and really attacked day 1 and day 2, and then another strategy, maybe attacking day 3. And so that's with the Hawkstrologer here. They very much attacked day 2. Again, they had a trade down with the Las Vegas Raiders, got the extra pick and extra pick for next year's draft. And I think that it's kind of fun because as it kind of acknowledged here, they basically said that we thought that there's a possibility that the Seahawks might do something that's a little bit different than what everybody is expecting. And right off the bat with the trade down, maybe that is something that we should expect, but taking a wide receiver with their first selection, I think would surprise a lot of people. So the USC wide receiver, Jordan Addison, obviously Pete Carroll would likely be a fan of that. The fact that Seattle had such success with so many different award winners a year ago, I think that it just kind of lends some credence to the idea that they might go with a guy who, of course, won the Blitnikoff Award as a member of the Pitt Panthers 2 years ago. But the wide receiver, Jordan Addison, we talked about the need for a third wide receiver, an edge rusher, Nolan Smith, one of my favorite players, a guy who I do believe that he does have the physicality and certainly the intensity to be able to kind of fit in as that 3-4 rush linebacker. Obviously, Seattle's got to be feeling pretty good about what they've got at that position right now, but you don't know that Uchenna Nwosu is going to be able to build upon what he showed last year. Darrell Taylor, Boye Mafe, et cetera, et cetera. I just think that these are 2 legitimate first-round caliber players, and to be able to get them at 15 and 20, and then again get that first-round pick next year in the trade down, I think makes an awful lot of sense. The tight end, Michael Mayer, as acknowledged by Hawkstrologer in his initial tweet, presumably his initial tweet, Mayer is just the best player available at that spot. Again, another player I view as a first-round round prospect, and is a guy we know the way the Seattle prioritizes the tight end position. Steve Avila is a really good football player. He's a guy that has that guard center experience. Is one of the things I really like about him. I think that he could step right in and contribute possibly at the right guard position, depending on what the Seahawks want to do with Phil Haynes, and of course with the veteran Gabe Jackson, who is still under contract. John Michael Schmitz, as we talked about many times before, is one of our favorite centers in this class. And I'm not going to go through every single player on this list, but I want to, because there's a lot of good players. Carl Brooks from Bowling Green, the defensive lineman, I thought was made as much money as just about anybody at the Senior Bowl this year. He was just absolutely dynamic, and so I just really like this class. And then I'll mention one last player. I just produced my top 10 favorite running backs in the class of 2023. It's on foxsports.com right now. And Corbin, one of the guys who was very much in the running to be in that list, Chris Rodriguez Jr., the running back for Kentucky. Everybody's talking about the quarterback, Will Levis. Watch the running back. He plays Seahawky kind of football. He does have some off-field stuff that I think is going to drop him down. So again, I think that this is the Hawkstrologer clearly has some, look into the skies and can, predict the future a little bit, because I do think that the viewer did a great job of anticipating where runs might go and really kind of setting the board fairly accurately. Whereas some of the other mock drafts I saw out there, I think there's going to be players that, they selected in the 5th round that I think are likely to be first round picks. So I just thought this was a very realistic mock draft in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is that this mock draft actually had 5 trades total. Yeah. And some fans would scoff at the idea of trading down not once but twice from number 5 overall. But I mean, if the top 2 defensive players are gone and you don't want to pick a quarterback early, that might be the best road to go, because you can really eat up on day 2 with 2nd and 3rd round picks. And that ended up being the rationale, the main strategy here. And John Schneider's done that. We saw that with the DK Metcalf trade, moving up into the back half of the 2nd round. He'll maneuver into day 2 up and down the board to get extra picks and get unique talents. And so that was really covered in this one. I went with maybe a more controversial one. Go figure. Of course, I'm going to go with a controversial one coming from chairman_E1492. And there's nothing controversial about the first selection. Tyree Wilson is maybe the most popular player, not named Jalen Carter, that is being mocked to the Seahawks by experts, whether it's pick 5 or a couple picks down, which this one, that's the case. A trade down, moving down to pick number 7. And what I liked about this one, and we know John Schneider will do this if the opportunity is there, trading down not just once but twice with both first-round picks to recoup extra selections in the meat of the draft in the middle. The selection at pick 30, though, is going to make a lot of fans bat their eyes a little bit. Bijan Robinson, the superstar running back from Texas, I would be surprised if he's there at 30, and at the same time, with where running backs have been going in drafts as of late, maybe he falls there. And if he's still there at 30, John Schneider and Pete Carroll might have a very hard time not making that selection, because he is that kind of a talent out of the backfield. And you can never have too many dynamic runners, especially on an offense like Seattle's. Siaka Ika at pick 37. I've mocked him a couple times. Big, massive mountain of a man that can rush the passer a little bit, coming from the Big 12. Luke Whippler from Ohio State is one of my top centers in my top 4 at the position group. I think getting him at 52 seems just about right. And I guess this is what I loved about this draft, Rob. Not only getting Whippler, but also getting Andrew Voorhees in the very next pick that you can plug in at one of the guard spots. You're getting 2 players that could start for you on day 1. And I think that has got to be a priority for the Seahawks in this draft, that interior offensive line. Get at least one guy in the first 3 rounds that you can plug right into the lineup and instantly upgrade your group that's going to have a high ceiling. Both those players are going to come into the league with that kind of buzz. And so I really like those selections on day 2. And then a couple picks on day 3 that jump out to me. J.L. Skinner, I'll talk about at some point later in the show. But Julius Brents, the 6'3", long arm corner from Kansas State, he is rising up draft boards after a pretty solid Senior Bowl week. I coached against the kid, so there's some bias in this pick. I really enjoyed coaching against him, watching him. He torched us. Really was a fantastic football player, and that has continued to the college level. Could you imagine another 6'3" athletic corner across from Tariq Woolen in the secondary? Brent's is a player that you could develop that eventually can get onto the field. I really like that pick in the 4th round. And at quarterback, we had our rule that you couldn't pick till after round 3. Dorian Thompson-Robinson in round 5 out of UCLA. Seahawk fans, Washington fans are going to know that name because of the Pac-12 conference playing for Chip Kelly. And he's one of those guys on day 3 that really fascinates me because I don't think he's a player that can come right in and play right away. But I also look at the athletic tools. He's got a big arm. There's all the physical tools there. If he's coached up by Greg Olson, that might be a guy that a year or 2 from now could be a very solid NFL quarterback. And you don't find those very often on day 3. So he is one of the few guys in this class that isn't going to go early that I could see potentially panning out, maybe being the Brock Purdy of this draft class that ends up being a solid NFL quarterback. Dorian Thompson-Robinson could end up being that player. So overall, I like the value on day 3, and I like the fact there were some good trench picks, and I like the controversy too, getting Bijan Robinson at the end of the 1st round. Now, Rob, I'm going to flip it back to you because we each have one more mock draft with slightly different approaches than the first 2 that we looked at.
Yeah, and as I was saying, this is a draft here, and this one was produced by a Twitter follower or Twitter user at Scott Howard FTW, I'm assuming, and it looks on the jersey that they're referencing as their Twitter image. Scott Howard being the character played by Michael J. Fox in Teen Wolf. So I'm assuming the FTW is Scott Howard for the win. And so I just love the name. And I really like this draft class as well. Now, what they did here is, again, there was a big time trade right off the bat, also trading with the Raiders. And so, trading down to the number 7 spot from number 5 overall, as well as getting that 2024 first round selection. So perhaps Greg Olson might be talking to some of his, former cohorts with the Las Vegas Raiders, to maybe help swing some kind of move like this. I think if you look at this draft class, I'm not in love with Myles Murphy at number 7 overall. Corbin, he's a player that we've talked about a lot. He is physically gifted. I just don't see him making as many plays as I would like to see somebody drafted in the top 10 make. But at the same time, he is just scratching the surface of his potential. He is a guy who is surrounded by so much talent at Clemson that maybe, that was part of the reason why he wasn't able to produce as many eye-popping plays, because some of the other guys have to make their big plays as well. So I do certainly acknowledge that another big, powerful guy at the line of scrimmage has to be a high priority, and that obviously is the priority in this selection. So again, Myles Murphy at number 7 overall, Jackson Smith-Njigba. I had Seattle making this exact same selection in my mock draft, so I certainly am not going to criticize at this point. I would say that I'd like to see Seattle try to get a little bit more speed at the receiver position, but again, with Smith-Njigba, a player that I think reminds me a little bit of Keenan Allen, just in terms of his route running and his soft hands. I think that he is just going to be an ultra reliable slot receiver that can come into the NFL and be very, very good, very, very early. So again, I like that pick. We talked about Steve Avila before. Again, another pick that I just think screams Seahawk in so many different ways, does have that center guard versatility. A couple of big guys. Ojomo, the big defensive tackle from Texas. A lot of people might remember when the beginning of the season, Texas and Alabama squared off, and the Longhorns gave Alabama a heck of a run there. A big part of that was because of how well they were able to shut down the interior running game, and Ojomo was a big part of that. Zach Pickens from South Carolina, a little bit lower, is a good football player who kind of just, to me, strikes a lot of Seahawk boxes in a lot of different ways. Speaking of Seahawk boxes, I don't know if there is a quarterback in this draft class. You mentioned DTR, Dorian Thompson-Robinson, with the previous mock draft. To me, DTR and Hendon Hooker are two of the guys on that middle round to day 3, I think make an awful lot of sense for the Seahawks because of a lot of different things. For one, it's the versatility. They're legitimate dual threat kind of quarterbacks. 2, it's obviously the production against elite competition. In the case of Hendon Hooker at Virginia Tech and clearly at Tennessee this past season or these past couple of years as well. I mean, just the fact that he never had a single season with more than 5 interceptions is just mind-boggling to me. And you just see the accuracy that he has. Obviously, he's coming off of the torn ACL. That's the reason why he is available at this point in the draft. But I just love that. I love the fact that this draft went back to the interior of the offensive line, just through multiple picks at that spot at the center guard positions. It's something that Seattle needs to work on. Jared Patterson from Notre Dame has got all kinds of buzz about him. He played at Notre Dame after all. But Scruggs from Penn State is a guy who turned some heads at the East-West Shrine Bowl. And so he is somebody I think that we got to mention. And I mentioned before from Bowling Green, Carl Brooks and how productive he was. Jose Ramirez from Eastern Michigan. Not a lot of people know about him. He just led the entire country in sacks this past season. So he is somebody that also checks a lot of boxes as far as the Seahawks like production. And these are some players that have potential as well as production. And so this, I thought, was a nice draft class that really kind of followed what the Seahawks had done in the past and betting heavy on their ability to find those diamond in the rough prospects on day 3. That's the strategy this draft took, and I think it's a sound one.
And I like the last selection on there. Isaiah Land is another player that made himself a lot of money at the Senior Bowl. And I know he's light, but he's also extremely fast coming off the edge. Yep. And that's just a kid that looks like he is scratching the surface of his talent coming from a smaller school in Florida A&M. And it looks like he could add some more muscle to his body. So that would be an intriguing late round flyer. And I'm going to throw out a name here that played for the Seahawks in the late 80s and early 90s that was an incredible pass rusher, Rufus Porter from a small school from Southern. That's the kind of player I could see Isaiah Land potentially being. And it's a different game now, but those smaller pass rushers, there's a place for them more than there was when Rufus Porter was getting a lot of sacks for the Seahawks. So that is a pick that I really like at the end of that draft that I just felt like I had to talk about. Let's get to my last mock draft now. And I already kind of set the table for this because it was my fault. The way that I worded the 2 rules on social media, there were several of you that were like, well, I'm going to take a quarterback early and I'm going to take one late. I'm going to do the Kirk Cousins, Robert Griffin III strategy. Well, there was one draft that jumped out to me that did have a quarterback going early. And it's not necessarily that I think that's what the Seahawks should do, but I looked at the way that the draft ended up unfolding and it felt really realistic to me. And so this one is coming from Trevor 4586, and it involved a trade down. Now, Anthony Richardson at number 8, that might seem a little bit rich, but Rob, you and I have both talked about this a lot on this podcast in terms of size and physical tools. Richardson might be the most enticing quarterback in this entire draft class. And when you have those physical tools and that size and athleticism, teams are going to pick you much earlier. And so there is a chance he could end up being a guy that goes in the top 10. And then at 20, Michael Mayer, the tight end from Notre Dame, not a speedster, but an incredibly talented player that also I think is the best run blocker at the position in a really good tight end class. And so at 20, they get another offensive player. And some of our listeners might be thinking, why is this mock draft being picked? Well, I really like the way the rest of this unfolded, getting the defense taken care of on day 2. Adetomiwa Adibara, I actually got it from Northwestern, is a player that I'm higher on than a lot of people. Had a very solid week in Mobile in the Senior Bowl. Doesn't necessarily play as fast as what you would expect looking at him from a testing standpoint. I think he's going to put up really good numbers at the combine, but I love that pick at 37 because I think he's a good fit in a 3-4. John Michael Schmitz at pick 44. Keanu Benton, one of my favorite interior linemen. You get him in round 2 to go with Ibarra. You just knocked it out of the park already. And there's a couple other players that are going to be added later in the draft. I would not be surprised if the Seahawks take 3 or 4 defensive linemen if they end up with 11 selections because they need to get players that fit the scheme that they are running. And I think that's the reason I loved this mock draft, is because you're getting a player in Benton that can play 3-tech 4-eye. He can play nose tackle. Ibarra can play a number of different positions as well along the defensive line. And then you also get later in the draft a player in Cameron Young in round 6 that you've mocked him a couple times earlier. He's a player that fits a 3-4 defensive scheme as well. You touch the offensive line with Cody Mock as well as John Michael Schmitz. Those two players could start for you on day one. Mock, I think, could play at like 4 different spots. The guy is insanely versatile. You get Julius Brents, you get a pass-catching running back in Eric Gray on day 3. I just thought this was an extremely well-rounded draft, and I liked the placement of the players. These mock draft simulators, it's really difficult to peg where these guys are going to go. None of us truly know, but this seems like from a value perspective that this was a very realistic mock draft, and the Seahawks checked off a lot of boxes, and they still went offense in the first round with their 2 picks.
Yeah, and I like one of the players that you did mention, Jamie Robinson from Florida State. I mean, he's a little bit undersized. That's why he might drop a little bit, but he is physical. He's a ball hawk. He's a sea hockey type of a safety. And so he's a really interesting one. We saw a couple of other mocks that had J.L. Skinner from Boise State, the exact opposite. I mean, he's all arms and legs. I mean, he's 6'3", 210 pounds, but he's just so long. He's often compared to Cam Chancellor. His game is very, very different than Cam Chancellor. But at the same time, I think from a national perspective, Corbin, there's not going to be a lot of people out there who think that the Seahawks are going to draft a safety. They're not going to draft a tight end. Those are 2 of the stronger positions. But when you break down the roster, we fully expect Seattle to draft a tight end, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if they went with the safety, if they do have 10 or 11 draft picks here. And then one last thing, you mentioned Julius Brents, the corner from Kansas State. I just love Kansas State as far as what it has this year in terms of its draft class, whether it be Brent, whether it be the running back Deuce Vaughn, whether it be the edge rusher and Aduke. I mean, you got some really good players in Manhattan, Kansas. So I think that Seahawks fans who are looking to kind of do some film work, make sure you watch the Kansas State Wildcats. The Seahawks as a franchise may not love the fact that I'm mentioning them, but I think that there's going to be a lot of Seahawks fans out there who are going to want to pay attention to what's going on there, because I would be surprised if Seattle doesn't wind up getting somebody from this draft class from Kansas State. They just have an awful lot of guys who really look like future Seahawks.
It's just another team. You can just tell they're really well coached. They're very disciplined. They're fundamentally sound, and they're just good football players. They're in that Iowa, Kansas State. I would also put Wake Forest in there the last couple of years. They seem to have players that just, maybe they're not the most athletic guys, but they have guys that are really fundamentally sound and can just play the game of football. Northwestern has some really good players in that regard as well. So those blue collar schools, I like to call them, but you can get some really darn good football talent from Kansas State this year. I'd be in full agreement with you. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks. We're available on all major podcast platforms and streaming 5 days a week on YouTube. Coming up tomorrow, it's going to be Transaction Tuesday. We will be kicking out a question on social media for all of our listeners to chime in on related to roster construction. Be on the lookout for that at my handle at Corbin Smith NFL. That's going to be coming your way. We'll be diving into that tomorrow and continuing our free agent primers as well. Hope you'll be listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.